Well, we are here with former judge Janice Brown and Professor John Yoo, both from the University of California at Berkley. Thank you for this opportunity. I want to ask you about economic freedom, the thing we were talking about yesterday. In general, what do you think is the best way, if there is any way, of protecting economic freedom in an economy?
Well, I would say that what we had initially with the American founding and the focus of American constitutionalism, what they were really saying is government is a necessary evil, so keep it small so that it doesn't have the ability to restrict liberty, particularly economic liberty. But their idea was that idea of property, how you acquire it, and being able to deal with it as you want to, is at the core of liberty. Because political rights don't mean anything. I mean, even Trotsky gets this, right? He says, if the government controls everything, your education, your shelter, your food, you don't really have any freedom. And this was something that, I think the framers of the Constitution understood very well.
I would say today, unfortunately, the vision of a natural law-based economic freedom has been under attack for 100 years almost now. And those attacks mostly succeeded because of our New Deal and Great Depression. But I think we're starting to live through a rebirth of it. I think it has to be not just judicial, but also the other branches of government too. It might expect too much of the judiciary to protect economic freedom by itself for decade after decade of both elected legislators and the executive branch to suppress them, which is what happened in the United States, I think, for about 50 years. But I think we're just starting to come into a period where there's a renewed appreciation for economic liberties. Some of it, I think, is spurred by the costs of regulation, which have been weighing down economies. I think part of it is young people are more interested in this new economy, which is harder to regulate. And then I think third is, philosophically or morally, people are returning back to the idea that economic rights might just be as important as political rights. In fact, you might think without economic rights, you can't successfully exercise your political rights because you need to have a certain amount of material wealth, I think, to have a successful economy, not a successful political system.
Mm-hmm. So if I understand well, I think both of you are talking about not only about political or legal institutions, but about philosophical things. I mean the way people understand liberty. Because in Peru, for example, we have a lot of institutions protecting or supposed to be protecting economic liberty. We have a mostly liberal constitution restricting power and enumerating a lot of liberties, economic liberties. We have also an administrative agency protecting liberty because they are eradicating barriers to the entry of the market. But at the end, we see that we have a lot of regulation nevertheless, that Congress is still enacting a lot of acts. The regulators are making a lot they are making a lot of decisions about the market, even when markets become more and more competitive. So at the end, it's probably not on, we don't have to focus only on political or legal institutions, but trying to make people understand or change their belief. At the end, but that seems a hard
That's,
task.
that's very difficult, isn't it? Partly, I think, I've thought a lot about this because I think philosophy really is key. It has to do with worldview. And there's this, I guess, great divide. I want to talk about that a little bit tonight, but basically between a view of human beings as competent and capable of directing their own lives. And not only that, a view that says that's the only moral way to deal with human beings, right? That they are free, independent creatures capable of making moral choices. And that's one way to think about it. And the other way is that, well, sort of this idea that they don't have these inherent rights, but government provides them. And that's a great dividing line, because if government is the source of your rights, then that basically shifts all the power to the government. And so it's a difference between whether human beings should be self-governing, right? And therefore protected from government taking away their freedom, or whether people are dependent on government for their rights, and therefore whatever government does, it's their decision to make. So, and I think it's difficult once people begin to feel dependent. I mean, once they accept that that's the purpose of government, I think it's very difficult to move that needle back, because it seems like you're taking away benefits from them. You know?
Yeah, I would say that from a philosophical level, this is sort of a deontological view of why economic liberties are just as important as political or civil or social rights, which most Western philosophers have been working on for the last 60 years, to the neglect of economic rights. I also think utilitarians who might have once been sympathetic to socialism or even communism have to accept, if you look at the record of history, that individual liberty-based economic systems create the most wealth for the most people. You've seen the failure of systems which subordinated economic liberty but also self-determination all around the world. And you've seen the rise of even China, which is unfortunately now, I think, we're turning more towards an authoritarian system. They moved the greatest number of people out of poverty in the shortest period of time in the history of mankind by recognizing a fair amount of economic freedom. Unfortunately, they're now clamping down on that, but it shows what can happen. So whether you're deontological or whether you're a utilitarian, you're both coming around to the idea that a freedom-based system is actually the best one for is a realization of individual potential or just for social welfare.
And one of the really sort of interesting demonstrations of that, I'm trying to think, I think it was Donald Rumsfeld maybe, that pointed out that if you look at a map, we have these GPS systems now with satellites who can give us a visual picture of this. And he was saying, if you look at the difference between South Korea and North Korea,
Light and no light.
just the light and no light, right?
So,
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing picture. It's a visual representation of the difference.
probably I am asking for free advice here, but what do you think we can do in a law school to engage with, to perform better, to make our students probably not change their minds, but to at least know that part of the story and that philosophical view.
Remember that free advice is worth what you pay for it, so just be warned. But, I don't know how law schools, how law is taught in Peru. I know how it's taught in the US, And one of the things that happened in the United States was we moved from the sort of notion of a classical education, which taught people about a lot of things, and most importantly, how to think critically, right? To this idea that what they call the casebook method. And the casebook method for us had the effect of moving people away from the actual documents, away from the actual discussion about why things were done, and what the motivating philosophy was, to this way of learning, of just learning what the courts had said about some particular thing, right? And just sort of memorizing the holding of the case. And I think, that's been very detrimental to American law schools. I don't know if Peru has a similar kind of problem or not.
Actually, we have adopted that method from the US.
Unadopted, that's my advice.
I think one thing law schools in Peru could do is study how certain kinds of institutions, primarily legal ones, can protect and create the conditions for this large amount of freedom. So I think in the past civil law systems, it was as Judge Brown described, you asked what rights did the government choose to give to you? Because that's the kind of civil law approach. But I think the conditions for this kind of freedom look primarily at you already have liberty, you give a little bit to the government, but you keep the rest. And what institutions do you create through the legal system to protect that initial choice so that there's no encroachment by the government? And so there, I think law might be one of the most important things, more so than because it endures. And I think it is true that the common law countries with a decentralized governing system have been more successful producing economic growth and innovation, entrepreneurship, all things we admire now and see as the future of the economy, than the civil law systems. And so that is really a legal question. How did the common law decentralized system succeed? What institutions are necessary? I think it's primarily decentralized, and that's what law schools and law students do, is to identify what could work in Peru. And what things you don't need to, because there are a lot of things we have you probably don't want to adopt, like punitive damages maybe, or, but there are a lot of important things that we might have, you can learn from the mistakes and successes of, the United States.
And I also think it's very important to think about what the rule of law really is. Because you can think of that as thick, right? As really being quite robust and powerful, or you can have a rule of law that is very thin, that is, in a sense, only nominal, right? If you say the rule of law is just that it was enacted by the appropriate authority, that could be anything. If you say the rule of law has to be consistent with the underlying telos, of our system, and we have an idea about how that should be. And so it's really dense network of interrelated ideas. It's not just that the rule was enacted, right, and promulgated. That's different. So I think it's important for law schools to not be technocratic, but to look more organically at what law is.
Peru, we have this, probably it's true not only in Peru, but in our countries as well, that if you ask someone in the street about economic freedom, they will tell you that they agree with you. They agree with the free market, all of that. But if you ask for a specific regulation, they will agree as well. In Peru now, probably we don't have this kind of hard regulation we have in the time of Garcia, for example, the tariffs or price regulations. But now we have things like, for example, if you produce salt, you have to put a label, a warning label, saying it has sugar, or it has, in North it has salt. This kind of like apparently minor regulation that is like summing up, like aggregating. We have more and more of this every time. And since it's like it's not that intrusive regulation, people tend to agree with it. So what do you think about this kind of lesser information regulation?
So I think we've seen this in the United States and other Western societies, the sort of creeping regulation, which is to pass very vague mandates, laws, and give a lot of discretion to the enforcement agencies, which essentially control large sectors of the economy just by giving permission or withholding permission. So there's a scholar in the United States who said we've become a government by permit. Right, rather than a government of rules. And this is not just, this is something, I think it's almost like regulation 2.0. It's the next stage of regulation. It's the way I think the liberty-based approach in the United States is trying to fight this is to restrict the amount of power that administrators can actually exercise. And so actually there's a lot of litigation from the US. There's a significant Supreme Court opinion last week, in fact, that several of the justices are calling for a restoration of an effort to block how much and how vague the power can be given to enforcement, executive branch enforcement agents. The other thing I think the American system can provide advice for Peru is that we have this idea, it goes all the way back to the founding of the country, that there should be certain spheres of life, like the economy, which are just free of all government regulation. A lot of civil law countries can't understand that idea that there's a negative area where there's no government at all.
Yeah.
It's just the civil law just don't have. But the American system that's the reason for things like the separation of powers and federalism was our Constitution was designed to make it just hard to wield government power at all. And so their idea was just when all these parts of the government conflict with each other, there will just be nothing but private activity. And then remember Tocqueville said in those areas then you will see spontaneously people will govern themselves through their own associations. And so I think in America we're trying to return to that kind of model. But the modern administrative state will fight every inch of the way because they love having this kind of vague discretion,
and they are
standardist power.
Yes.
They are already in existence,
Yes.
and it's absolute power. And in that sense, it's despotic power. But when you were saying that, that's exactly what I thought of, is Tocqueville's observation that when you have what he calls the tutelary government, right? The government that sees its role as teaching and making all of the decisions for you and helping you because you're somehow incapable of doing that for yourself. But that government, he says, will cover all of life with this, patchwork of, tiny little rules and, sort of dealing with every tiny aspect of life in minute detail. And so he says, and that, doesn't take things away, or doesn't seem to. What the effect that it has, though, is to completely innervate and reduce you to this, sort of docile, sheep-like existence. And so it's interesting because when he looked at America, he sort of said, well, that's kind of inevitable if you have a government and that was before we had the rise of the administrative state. So imagine, he was looking at this long before all of that happened. So imagine how difficult to shift the weight of that after all these years.
So, Peru might be interesting because Tocqueville was contrasting America and Europe. He said in Europe, nobody forms their own association. They wait for the government to tell you to form it. In the United States, people spontaneously try to govern themselves. You know, Peru is in the New World also.
Yeah.
And Peru is on the Pacific coast. You know, the weight of gravity of the world economy is moving. You know, we're going to be living in the Pacific century. You know, Peru could leave all that behind. You know, this European sort of central planning, centrally controlled society and economy. And because you can tell the Asian countries are more like the United States than they are like Europe. And I think that's the future for us to figure out in the United States how to, you know, become more free, less government. And Peru could join that, it seems to me, because of its location and its history.
Okay, Peru, at least as I saw, it's a mix because we have this civil law heritage, but we adopted the system of administrative agencies. So we have this regulation of the market and also these codes of civil law and civil procedure. And so, but just to finish the interview with a question about the future. What do you think it's an open question, but only for a brief remark. What do you think is the future of law that we were talking about yesterday?
This is, I think, the area where, again, law schools and law professors, law students can be very important, because I think in the new economy, intellectual ideas are the new form of wealth and economic growth. You always will be important to have mining and agriculture. That growth of that is going to be static, relatively static. All the future large leaps of welfare and economic activity are coming from ideas, concepts, not necessarily manufacture of hard items anymore. And lawyers are the ones who define what the rules of property for all of that will be. So I think the immediate future, it would be good to produce more lawyers, not less lawyers, that would provide a stable, safe place for people to develop their own ideas, companies, and then to know that they'll be protected, that the government won't regulate them out of existence, that people can make contracts and invest, and they will get the returns without the government taking a large share of it. And I think that'll determine which countries win and lose in this new kind of economy. And so countries right now can become just as competitive as any others by adopting the right legal rules and culture to allow that to happen, it seems to me.
I think that's really true and really insightful. One of the strange things that seems to be happening is that, the rise of contract meant that we moved away from status as a way of looking at the world, right? Mm-hmm. And we moved to this allowing people to make their own decisions and enforcing the decisions that they made. And what started to happen, in the 70s, I guess, but certainly in the 80s and 90s, was courts actually moving away from contract back to status, because we had all these anti-discrimination laws and all of these things that focused on groups as groups, right? And so if there is a future for freedom, I think it has to mean that we move away from status as the defining paradigm, and back to allowing people to make their own decisions and use their faculties in the way that they see best.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Oscar.